Welcome back. Welcome back to the Generous Justice curriculum videos. This is week 5. We're discussing how should we do justice. And with me for a second time is the lovely Rich Sylvester, our pastor of global and local engagement, who's uniquely suited to tell us how we should do justice because it's a pretty big part of his job. So thanks for being here, Rich. And
wow.
Yeah.
No pressure on that one, Tim.
You're our expert. You're our in-house expert.
Is my job on the line?
I'm not sure that I'm qualified to make that call, but I would say yes. Your job is on the line. But,
no pressure.
First of all, do you have any, last time you were here, you had a pretty good a recent grooming experience. Anything new today in your nails, your hair, your eyebrows?
No, good to know, Tim. I'm groomed up, no horror stories, and I'm doing all right.
That's good.
Plucked my eyebrows. No, I didn't really. I've never done that before in my life. I shouldn't have said that on tape.
That's a good rumor to get around. Hey, did you guys hear about that Pastor Rich? He's a pretty good guy, but I hear he plucks his eyebrows.
You know, to be honest, I do occasionally find some really long ones that I pull out because it looks a little creepy.
I don't think we need to have a new term for that. That's not plucking. That's like
thinning.
Thinning. Yeah, thinning. I don't want to be. I don't know.
Okay.
We'll come up with something more masculine. But so let's jump into the material then, since we've covered
That's a good segue,
your
Tim.
bodily hair weekly update. So that's me. So I'm doing a brief summary of chapter 6. How should we do justice? And so Keller, to me, really talks about. He starts off with Job 29, which I think you said you're going to get more into, but about how he always puts on righteousness, which reminds me of a sermon Trav gave a while ago about his dad down in Virginia Beach at Spring Branch Community Chapel. Mr. Simone has this black blazer that he wears all the time, and people think he dresses really nicely, but it's really just this one blazer he's always wearing. And Trav made me buy a black blazer, so I have one too now. So that's what Job does. He's always cloaked in righteousness, and I thought that was just an important image. And the weekly Keller challenging quote for me comes from this section. If you are a Christian and you refrain from committing adultery or using profanity or missing church, but you don't do the hard work of thinking through how to do justice in every area of life, you are failing to live justly and righteously.
Yeah, it's a powerful statement, Tim.
So I don't have anything to say about that, but but it's hard. So let's move on. And then Keller talks about levels of help, which reminded me of so many conversations we've had. And he says the levels of help are relief, development, and social reform. Then he talks about the needs of poor communities, and he talks about this guy named John Perkins, whose life and works are the basis for how a lot of the churches do.
By the way, it's an amazing biography on John Perkins. It's an autobiography, and it's called Justice Roll Down, and it's a life changer and an amazing story.
See, this is why you're the expert. This is your job, because I had never heard of John Perkins before.
Don't say that out loud, Tim. No,
it's
okay.
At least I don't pluck
You're
my
right. I
eyebrows.
hadn't either, and I'm glad I do know John Perkins.
I'm glad you know John Perkins too. And then Keller talks about race relations and injustice, which is a big deal, especially to Keller. One of the main areas he sees injustice is in racial areas, and I thought he had some great stuff to say here. And he talked about how most Christians, they want to change things by one person at a time. And Keller's like, well, sometimes we need to change whole social systems, which I thought was great. And then putting it all together, he talked about how churches in these poor areas or urban areas can really become communities of healing. And then what I thought was particularly applicable to our community is he talked about what about churches that aren't, surrounded by a great amount of poverty? Like, how do we go about meeting the local needs? And he talked about how we should go and identify it. So I found this, particularly for me, I found this chapter very challenging, and I'm excited to see what you think. So, what was your main takeaway?
Yeah, a lot of good takeaways. It's a long chapter.
It's very long.
Because I think how to do justice is a really difficult question. I remember when I first moved to Honduras with my wife, we had just gotten married, and a week later we said, let's go do something crazy. So we flipped a coin, and if it landed on heads, it was head to Honduras, and if it landed on tails, it was think of something else to do. And it landed on heads, and so we got on a plane and we moved to Honduras. And our world exploded. I grew up just outside New York City where I thought I was the poor kid because when I turned 16, my car was a few years old and wasn't brand new. But my world exploded, and the reality of what people were living like and what the average family's making in the world hit me hard. And I remember the first night a kid, his name was Walter, came and knocked on our door, and he said, "Deme comida." He said, "Give me food." And at that time, I hadn't even learned Spanish that well yet, and I sort of got it from the charades that he wanted food. But over this history of 2 years living in Honduras, Susie and I built a strong relationship with his family. He had 7 brothers and sisters and a mom and dad, and they all lived in a little wooden shack a couple hundred yards from where I was living.
Wow.
And I remember so many people had opinions about what we should do to help, how we should help. Some people said, "Oh, never give them food without making them sweep your patio first." And others would say, "Don't give them food at all." And others would say, "Oh, you don't want to mess with that. It's too big a scenario for you." And there were all these thoughts on how you should do things, why you should do things, if you should do things. And at the end of the day, we asked a question that Keller brings up in his chapter. We asked Walter and his family how they wanted Susie and I to help. Because we came into the scenario thinking we know exactly what this family needs. And if you think about the ridiculousness of that statement, we had just moved to Honduras. We didn't even speak their language. We didn't understand their culture. And yet I thought I could figure out how to fix this family's problems. Well, it turned out that they asked us for a few things. When we said, "How can we help you?" They came up with a much better solution than we ever could. And through a little microloan to buy a little wooden, I wouldn't even call it a cart because it didn't have wheels, but it was basically, it had a leather strap around their neck, and it was a wooden...
like a ballpark vendor?
Yes, like a ballpark vendor,
Okay.
and it would had gum and lollipops and different candies. And through this little microloan and helping them get this little box, they were able to make money down in the city to support their family. And eventually they paid us back in full and even had us over to their house for dinner so that we could, they could celebrate the gift that we had given them. And I thought, I never would have even begun to have thought of that. I would have thought, well, I'll give them food, I'll give them money. But when we asked the question, how can we help you? They had the right answer. And so often when it comes to how to doing justice, we step into a situation and we say, I know the answer for you. And I think that that is really backwards. I think Tim Keller brings up a great point, and he says, really getting to John Perkins and his expertise, you need to ask people, what do you need? What can help you? You go into a community and you ask, what can your community benefit from? Instead of walking into a scenario saying, I've got all the answers. Really, they've got all the answers. They just need some resources.
Well, I think that's an unbelievable point. I'd never thought of that before this chapter, because from my perspective, it always seems like every 2 or 3 years, like, okay, this is how you should go about it, and like the process changes, but asking the question seems to one of these things, like maybe the best solution is the one that makes the most sense. Like, it doesn't have to be super complicated.
Right. I mean, as heroes, we think we have to have the answers, but
Right.
We don't. A lot of times people have their own answers.
People are smart,
Yes.
and they know what they need. So, what was your favorite scripture passage from this section?
You already mentioned Job, and I really love that. Keller quotes Job in the beginning of that chapter, and he says right here, he says, I put on righteousness as my clothing, justice was my robe and turban. It's not the only time in Scripture that we're told that our dress should be more than the clothes we wear, right? Colossians,
right.
Clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, those sorts of things. And then as you look at even the idea of clothing and garments throughout Scripture, you realize that in essence we clothe ourselves with Christ. And when we clothe ourselves with Christ, then justice and mercy becomes a major part of our life. And so I think about that. Do I wake up in the morning? Do I think instead, how can I look good for my wife? Or does
good
this
for a
shirt
video series?
look good for the video series?
Right.
Do my shirt and tie go well together? Really, I need to be asking the question, am I dressing myself with a mindset that looks to mercy, to justice, to compassion, to love? And when I'm doing that, then I'm really following what Jesus wants me to do. And so we look at the hero of Job in Scripture who had a great mindset about those things. and we're reminded ourselves to clothe ourselves with the things that matter to Christ, to clothe ourselves with Christ, and in essence, clothe ourselves with compassion, humility, gentleness, grace, justice, and mercy.
Absolutely. So with all that said, there's a lot of meat already, a lot of thoughts for this week's small group from this important chapter. What one thing would you like to leave with them, though, before they go into their group study?
Yeah, Tim, you're right. It's a lot of material. The idea of how to do justice is overwhelming.
Big concept,
It's a big concept. And I think because it's so overwhelming, so often people say, I just can't do it. I can't get my head around it. I can't figure it out. How can little me do something so big? But as Tim Keller ends his chapter, he talks about spheres of justice. And I think the great question to ask is, what sphere has God placed me in that I can do justice in? And whether it's your family, your neighborhood, your school, your job, God has placed you in a specific place for a specific reason. And I think if we wake up in the morning and ask ourselves, how can I do justice in the sphere that God has given to me today, then we're asking a great question. Because you combine all these questions and you get, what's my sphere? And then we go to our sphere and we say, what do you need? I think those two questions together make for a huge impact. And instead of us walking around wondering what we're going to do, God gives us a specific thing that we can do, and a lot of little specific things make a big impact and change the world around us. And so I think that's what we do.
Right, absolutely. And so far, the first 5 weeks of the series and our video today have been mainly theoretical, but this is a week for the small groups where y'all are really going to get down to the application. And every week there's been an application, but so I think we can challenge you this week when you get into your small groups to really discuss what that sphere is and how you can help it and what to do, and come away with actual applications and first steps. And this is a time for action, not just thinking about it. We want to think about it, but
hold
we want
each
to have
other
action.
accountable as a group. I mean, make a commitment. I'm going to do this week in the sphere that God's given me, and go do it. And next week, talk about what that looked like and what the result was, and celebrate what God was able to do through you in that sphere that He's given you.
So we've covered a lot of theoretical material this week, and this is a time where we'd really like to challenge you, the small group, to go forward and actually kind of define the scope and define the sphere and come up with an action that pertains to what we've talked about. So we've done a lot of the intellectual work, and y'all are about to do some more. But I think we'd really like to challenge you to take a first step towards action. There's been these application sections in the small group curriculum each week, and this isn't just a thought-provoking week. This is a thought-provoking and action-oriented week of the study. So that's all for me and Rich. Thank you very much, Rich, as always.
Thank you, Tim.
It's a pleasure to sit next to you. And so please go and think and act, and we'll be back next week.